Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. The psychologist Carl Rogers stated that a person's ideal self, who he'd like to be, may not be consistent or in sync with what actually happens in life. A person's ideal self may not be consistent with the real self, who we are forced to live with. He believed that the ideal self and the real self need to be close together, and what he calls in a state of congruence in order to be well. Incongruence is when they are far apart and the ideal and the real self are not compatible with each other. To live an authentic life, or as Shakespeare puts it, to thine own self be true, according to Carl Rogers, is very good advice. Claudius, well, he's a lesson of what can happen when it goes wrong. When these two selves, the ideal and the real, are far apart. He's a lesson of what becomes of a person and their world when they use words instrumentally to manipulate others, to seduce. As he describes it, my most painted word. At the beginning of this play, Claudius stands before Denmark. He is king, and he is mourning the recent death of his brother, the former king. And he's taken to wife his brother's queen. He seems to have it all together. He seems to be very well organized. In Act 1, Scene 2, he speaks, with one auspicious and one dropping eye, with mirth in funeral and dirge in marriage, in equal scale weighing delight and dole. In reality, however, his real self is very unorganized. In fact, it is in conflict. Visceral disgust over his murder is threatening his calm facade. He is experiencing undesirable negative emotions. He's psychologically tense. And as we see in this scene, he eventually erupts. According to Carl Rogers, he is not feeling, experiencing, and behaving in ways he would like to. In Act 3, Scene 1, Claudius speaks of his most painted word and its ugliness to him. How smart a lash it is to his conscience. O heavy burden. The theory of Carl Rogers is based directly on what is known as the phenomenal field. The word phenomenon comes from a Greek word that means to shine forth. So phenomena are the things that shine forth for you. So some things announce themselves on your field of consciousness, and other things don't. For Claudius, the things that are announcing themselves to him or lashing his conscience are feelings of disgust over his murder that he would like to keep suppressed. These are the things he would like to avoid. But as Freud states, your consciousness is not necessarily the master in its own house. And as Carl Rogers cautions, to ignore a private experience leads to psychopathology. It leads to neurosis. To ignore a private experience is what warps you. Carl Jung also believed that private experiences should not be ignored. He stated that if you follow the things that announce themselves to you as meaningful, that they could take you through a descent to begin with, where you would encounter things that you were afraid of, terrified of, and disgusted by, and wanted to avoid. And the consequence of that would be that you would incorporate a lot of new material into your personality. And the consequence of that would be that you would be reborn into a stronger person. This scene is about Claudius no longer being able to avoid the horror of his murder. His no longer being able to avoid the truth about himself which hurts. And this is all because Hamlet holds a mirror up to what Claudius does not want to see. The play The Mousetrap reveals the true Claudius, his real self, that he does not want anyone else to see. And this is why Hamlet was so very critical of the actors. Their performance had to be as real to life as possible. Only then could the psychological tension manifest itself. Only then could the psychological tension exist to erupt, which was what exactly Hamlet was looking to see. As Carl Rogers stated, an incongruent individual lives a life that is under constant threat. And as the threats mount, the work of protecting the self-concept becomes more difficult. If the situation worsens, their personality may erupt uncontrollably. This is a psychology that Shakespeare well understood. And as the player king speaks in this scene, when a person's ideal self is not consistent with what actually happens in life, our wills and fate do so contrary run, that our devices or our plans still are overthrown. Our thoughts are ours, their ends none our own. And lastly, as with regards to Claudius and his psychological tension created with his use of the most painted word. In contrast, Hamlet's speech and his use of mad, wild words seem to produce the opposite effect, a release in psychological tension. They have fooled him to the top of his bent. Madness is his way to get free of all of them. And this scene's madness seems especially cathartic, in that by the end he's now able to do such things as the day would quake to look upon. For Hamlet, mad, wild words set him free.